Hey, welcome back everyone. We're again here broadcasting from my apartment, notably for the last week, and then I'll be back in the office. But we're going to be continuing these broadcasts Monday through Friday, 5 days a week. And real quick, some of you may notice we didn't have a video yesterday or the day before. That was nothing big happened, don't worry. That's just us prepping to be back in the office again and getting the team and everything back together. So first off today, we're going to be looking into the question of whether the Chinese regime would turn to open warfare. We're also going to be going to the issue of online censorship here in the United States. You may have seen that Trump is signing this executive order. And we're also going to be looking into what's happening right now in Hong Kong and the significance of the United States standing up against the Chinese Communist Party's incursions against Hong Kong autonomy. Now folks, before we get started, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, really need your help supporting this channel. And also, if you want to go the extra mile, we do accept donations, and also we appreciate any kind of support. If you want to tell a friend or family about the show, it really helps us as well. So first off, we're going to be looking into the question of whether the Chinese regime would turn to open warfare were the economic war and the, say, soft power war to fail. And so let's look at a few different points on this first. So CNN reported that China's military promises to uphold national sovereignty as more Hong Kong protests are expected. Now, Chen Daoxiang, the PLA commander in Hong Kong, said Tuesday, quote, "Garrison officers and soldiers are determined, confident, and capable of safeguarding national sovereignty and development interests." And he continues, quote, "conducive to deter separatist forces and external intervention." When they talk about separatist forces, they're talking about different forces, say Tibetans, for example, calling for a free Tibet. They're talking about Taiwanese calling for or saying that Taiwan will never be a part of China. And they're talking about people in Hong Kong calling for democracy. That's what they call separatist forces. And when they talk about external intervention, they're talking about countries like the United States that are placing sanctions on Hong Kong if it goes through with these abusive laws that they're now putting into place. Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, asked the military to scale up battle preparations. We also have a story, China's expanding military reach. Taipei Times says, quote, "It is apparent that Beijing is intensifying its political management and military control over the disputed Spratly Islands. Taiwan, which relies heavily on the sea line of communication in the region, must be vigilant about the PLA, People's Liberation Army's, expansion in the South China Sea." So in other words, the Chinese Communist Party has not backed off of this aggressive expansion into the South China Sea during this time. Here we have the drive. China's largest base has replicas of Taiwan's presidential building and the Eiffel Tower. The Chinese Communist Party has replicas of different buildings in different countries at its military bases for training, notably the Taiwanese presidential palace. And in Taiwan, this is of course being interpreted as the Chinese Communist Party preparing and training for a raid on the presidential palace. So the story here says, quote, "Through satellite images, we explore China's premier large-scale training site that has some ominous and bizarre features." And here we have a story from CNN. China's defense budget shows Xi's priorities as economy tightens. When China announced a 6.6% increase in its military budget last week, while cutting substantially in other areas, analysts said it made one thing clear. Beijing senses an increasing security threat and is giving the People's Liberation Army the military muscle to deal with it. While unemployment is a big issue in China, while the country is struggling to get back on its feet, what is it putting its money into more heavily? It's putting its money more heavily into the military. And so this whole picture paints, I think, a few questions. Would the Chinese Communist Party turn to open warfare if, say, its other methods of influence around the world were to fail at this time? This is my take on this. Now, when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party's military ambitions, it has two different fronts. There's the unconventional warfare system, what they call unrestricted warfare. And then there's the kinetic, the open warfare system, which they would define as their Assassin's Mace program. Now, unrestricted warfare, it includes a whole slew of different strategies. It includes, for example, non-military, trans-military, and unconventional open military tactics. Unconventional open military might be things like, for example, terrorist warfare, indirect, say, war through proxies, biological warfare, biochemical warfare. It could include, for example, the use of low Earth orbit nuclear detonation for EMP. These are things written in their doctrine. I'm not just saying this, these are things written in their doctrine. Non-military could be things like economic war, business warfare. Trans-military could include things like cyber warfare. In other words, military operations. We all know Chinese hackers run a lot of the cyber theft operations, for example. We could go forever into the different, nuances and sub-branches of warfare, but here's what it really comes down to. The Chinese regime had assessed that open warfare with the United States was not really feasible. And so how do you wage war when your adversary is more technologically advanced than you are? When you wouldn't be capable of winning an open war? What do? Well, it took a different path of thought. What would you want to achieve through war? And how can you achieve those exact same objectives using non-kinetic means? In other words, means that are not involving guns and jets and missiles and these kinds of things. And so what becomes the weapons in this war? It's anything the Chinese Communist Party can use. Foreign direct investment, business warfare, media warfare, the control of outlets of information, culture warfare, like its takeover of Hollywood, drug warfare, the poisoning of the country's youth. Notably, the Chinese Communist Party is the largest supplier of precursor chemicals to the drug cartels. Also one of the main sources of these synthetic drugs like fentanyl. And so they've developed this whole system of unconventional war. Now, a lot of that right now is being destabilized because a lot of it was working through the manipulation of the open systems in different countries. You could say, arguably, that the One Belt, One Road initiative is part of that, where it's going into countries, Latin America, Africa, getting countries into debt traps through these different economic packages. The countries default on the debts. The Chinese regime takes over the assets. And so basically they use this to subjugate different countries, essentially. A lot of that is failing right now. A lot of the Chinese Communist Party's different methods within that unrestricted warfare space are failing right now. The economic war is getting pretty much stomped out. The US-China trade war, for example, dealt some huge blows into that. With Japan, India, even the United States now talking about paying companies to leave China when it comes to manufacturing, that's being uprooted. When it comes to different countries, for example, in the UK, talking about how they need to forbid Chinese foreign direct investment. And also a lot of its soft power initiatives, propaganda, these things. They had this wolf warrior diplomacy approach, where they took a more aggressive stance when it comes to their messaging. And that really backfired. A lot of countries that were pretty favorable to the Chinese regime have now turned against it. At least in terms of the verbal war, they've turned against it. Australia, UK, many parts of the EU, for example, the United States, for example. This is where the kinetic war comes into place. The big question of if all these other forms of warfare, if all these other forms of control that they had are failing, will they launch an open war? It is unlikely that they would be able to. I do think that they would want to. I think that they would try to, possibly. If this virus hits the Chinese economy, if it hits internal stability to an extent where the Communist Party itself is at risk of losing control. Because just like a cornered rat, just like a cornered dog, it is sometimes more dangerous in that state because it will act in ways that are meant to basically defend its life. For the Chinese Communist Party, the state it's in right now is life or death. And so if the regime itself is risking collapse, there's nothing beyond them. The problem they have is that when it comes to engaging in open warfare, when it comes to, say, waging a conventional war, it's arguable whether they could win. Even in warfare scenarios, for example, with Taiwan, which is a pretty small country, it's questionable whether the Chinese regime could actually win that war. And if you brought in, for example, Taiwan, Japan, the United States, and possibly other countries as well, it wouldn't end, I think, in full warfare. What I do think would happen is that China would be basically isolated, and internally through that isolation, the regime would risk collapse. And so if that were to happen, what are their options? And well, they could rally up their allies, for example, Russia, Iran, North Korea. The question is whether these countries would want to do that right now, and whether they like the Communist Party enough to do so. Now, when it comes to Iran, for example, one of the former main allies of the Chinese Communist Party, they are pretty angry at the Chinese regime right now. Notably, some of the leaders in Iran actually came out and criticized the Chinese regime for lying to them about the virus. You may have seen some of the reports. Different news outlets were talking about how the mass graves in Iran are so many when it comes to this virus that you can see them from space. A lot of the reports have talked about leadership in Iran specifically having been hit hard by this virus. Notably, the number of dead among the leadership in Iran has led a lot of people, a lot of analysts to believe that the death toll may be actually much higher. When it comes to Russia right now, would they risk the fate of their entire country when they're really turning more towards this more nationalist stance? Would they risk the fate of their entire country to support the Chinese Communist Party, one of their frenemies, really, when it comes down to it? I don't think so. Some people may argue otherwise. Some people I respect, Jeff Nyquist, for example, is a great researcher. I think he'd argue otherwise. I do disagree. I don't think Russia would want to get into a conflict like that. I don't think it serves any interest to them. Then there's North Korea. Now, when it comes to the factional battles inside the Chinese Communist Party, North Korea was technically under the control of the former faction, the Jiang faction, 2 leaders ago, Jiang Zemin. Xi Jinping, it's arguable whether he actually has a lot of influence over North Korea right now. And also North Korea is struggling with the virus as well. And so China's allies are not only, let's say, dealing with their own crisis right now and dealing with their own internal problems of stability right now, but they're also dealing with the question of whether they would come to the rescue of the Xi faction or of the Chinese Communist Party overall. Personally, I doubt it. I don't think that would happen. Now, the big question is, would the Chinese Communist Party launch a war on the United States if it were, for example, to have the conditions for it, if it were to have support from its different allies? Yes, it would, and that's when we get into the Assassin's Mace program. The issue with the Assassin's Mace program is it relies on surprise attack. If you read the doctrine, it talks about using pretty brutal and, I'd say, decimating means to very quickly win a war against a country like the United States. For example, the use of anti-satellite weapons, knocking out the eyes and ears of the U.S. military. If you lose the satellites, you lose GPS, missiles can't find their targets, ships have trouble navigating, communication systems of troops go out of line or go offline. It would include, for example, surprise attacks on all the major U.S. bases. It talks about these things. The problem again with that is it only works with surprise attack. The idea of Assassin's Mace would be to bring the United States to its knees within 2 weeks. Within 2 weeks, bring the U.S. to the negotiating table. And the U.S. has been privy to this strategy for a long time. Now, notably, Dr. Michael Pillsbury, in his book, The 100-Year Marathon, wrote about the Assassin's Mace program. Basically, they do these red team operations at the Pentagon. And the only time the Pentagon lost one of these red team operations against China was when Dr. Pillsbury applied the Assassin's Mace program. It is a dangerous strategy. It is a pretty devastating strategy, but it's one the United States has been aware of for a long time and has been preparing for. And now that you're in a situation where all the eyes and ears are on the Chinese regime, they don't really have an option to use that, in my analysis at least. Now, moving on to the United States, we're in an interesting situation now where different social media platforms are being called out for political-based censorship. So starting off, the Daily Mail reported, quote, Donald Trump will sign executive order on social media after threatening to close platforms he claims are censoring conservatives in wake of Twitter fact-checking his tweets. And so Trump wrote on Twitter on May 26, Twitter is now interfering in the 2020 presidential election. They are saying my statement on mail-in ballots, which will lead to massive corruption and fraud, is incorrect, based on fact-checking by fake news CNN and the Amazon Washington Post. And he continues, Twitter is completely sifting free speech, and I, as president, will not allow it to happen. President Donald Trump has signed the executive order on preventing online censorship, and this aims to stop censorship on websites including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube.
Thank you very much. We're here today to defend free speech from one of the gravest dangers it has faced in American history, frankly, and you know what's going on as well as anybody. It's not good. A small handful of powerful social media monopolies controls a vast portion of all public and private communications in the United States, and we know what they are. We don't have to name them. We're going to give you a complete listing. The choices that Twitter makes when it chooses to suppress, edit, blacklist, shadow, ban, are editorial decisions, pure and simple. They're editorial decisions. In those moments, Twitter ceases to be a neutral public platform and they become an editor with a viewpoint. And I think we can say that about others also, whether you're looking at Google, whether you're looking at Facebook, and what they're doing is tantamount to monopoly, you can say. It's tantamount to taking over the airwaves. Can't let it happen. Otherwise, we're not going to have a democracy. We're not going to have anything to do with a republic.
Now, notably, Twitter has been putting these fact-check alerts on different tweets. And they went back even through some of the older tweets from Trump and put these fact checks on them. If you click these fact checks, it gives, statements saying what Trump said is false and so on. Already, notably, some of these different fact checks themselves have shown to be at least partially false. And so again, it's this question of who fact checks the fact checkers. Now, going on to some of the different fallout on this, and I'm going to go over a few headlines and we'll go into some deeper analysis. Now, this is from Daily Mail. Head of Twitter's site integrity in charge of fact-checking Trump has previously tweeted the administration are Nazis, compared Kellyanne Conway to Joseph Goebbels, and said flyover states are racist. And so this brings up the question of who are these individuals running these fact checks, and do they have different motives when it comes to their own political viewpoints? We can't accuse this individual of, for example, acting out of bias. Maybe he believes that what he's saying is completely accurate. But it does bring up the question of whether Twitter and these different social media platforms are publishers of content, or whether they're just platforms for people to share their different opinions and ideas. Are they platforms for open discourse, forums for open discourse? Or are they media platforms that have taken it on themselves to determine what is true and what is false and to restrict the free discourse of others? Now, that said, you may have remembered the story we had about YouTube deleting automatically some different Chinese characters if you were to paste them into the comment section on videos. These characters were the phrase communist bandit and 50 cent. Now, notably, communist bandit is one of the insults against the Chinese Communist Party, which goes back to some of the wars between the nationalists and the communists in China. And 50 Cent refers to the Chinese Communist Party's 50 Cent Army, its main army of internet trolls who are paid to leave comments on different websites such as YouTube. And so, in other words, if you were to paste these terms, the Chinese characters notably, into the YouTube comment section, within about 20-30 seconds, your comment would automatically disappear. And so YouTube has now come out and admitted that they were doing this. They claim, though, that it was done by accident. They claim that it was put into their different AI algorithms meant to delete spam. And so who knows whether they're telling the truth, but this ties into the bigger picture of these different social media platforms censoring free speech. And at the same time that this is happening, the Chinese Communist Party has been utilizing different social media platforms for its own benefit, including these different ones we use in the West, including YouTube, including Facebook, including Twitter. Here's from BBC. Coronavirus inside the pro-China network targeting the US, Hong Kong, and an exiled tycoon. And it says, quote, hundreds of fake or hijacked social media accounts have been pushing pro-Chinese government messages about the coronavirus pandemic on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, a BBC investigation has found. Here's another story from the Varsity in Canada, how the spread of COVID-19 was censored on Chinese social media. Now, I've mentioned before, the Chinese regime has an entire military program adopted into its military code dedicated to this type of work. It's the three warfares doctrine: psychological warfare, media warfare, and legal warfare. We're seeing these social media platforms not just fact-checking the president, but also fact-checking other websites, other news stories as well, even individuals' claims. This is one issue we face as a society. We are now a technological society where everybody has a smartphone in their pockets, and a lot of us do our jobs on a computer. Many of us share with our family through social networks. Now, what happens if all of these platforms that we use as one of our main forms of communication then starts restricting our speech? And now, notably, in a constitutional republic like the United States, where citizens are entrusted to make, say, informed decisions to choose their future leaders, what are their informed decisions based on? They're informed by the news outlets, by the information they're able to collect. And so if platforms take it on themselves to restrict the ability of individuals to collect information and to decide for themselves whether they think this is trustworthy, whether they think this is false, whether they think this is disinformation. And so this raises this question. Is it correct if these outlets are able to determine what you can or cannot see? Is it right for these organizations to tell you that information is false based on their own sources, and notably on their own sources that have their own agendas and opinions when it comes to a lot of these topics? Are these impartial sources? Is their analysis impartial? And what is the credibility of the organizations making these determinations on whether information is right or not? Are they trustworthy? One of the issues we have in the United States is that the trustworthiness of these news outlets is really based on different party lines. Conservatives probably don't trust CNN. Democrats, liberals, they probably don't trust Fox News. And so when it comes to their different analysis, can you restrict them? Can you forbid them from being able to decide for themselves whether they want to trust information and whether they want to trust these different news outlets? And so when it comes to the coming elections, the 2020 elections, and the situation we're in right now, where these different outlets are taking it on themselves in cooperation with different media platforms, in cooperation with different nonprofits, to restrict free discourse, to restrict people's ability to access information, notably on the platforms that now dominate our ability to collect and share information. Would that qualify as interfering with the elections? This is going to be one of the big topics, in my analysis at least, going forward. And also, I'm curious what your own thoughts are on this. Let me know in the comments section. And moving into now the last story of the day, when it comes to Hong Kong and the Chinese regime's actions to implement these national security laws, which many countries, including the United States, say are bringing an end to Hong Kong's autonomy. Now, first off, Trump at a press conference said this.
Now we're doing something now. I think you'll find it very interesting, but I won't be talking about it today. I'll be talking about it over the next couple of days, Jen. Okay?
Something special that you mentioned on China, does that include sanctions?
No, it's something you're going to be hearing about before the end of the week. Very powerfully, I think.
And in addition to all of this, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had this to say in a statement, quote, "The State Department is required by the Hong Kong Policy Act to assess the autonomy of the territory from China. After careful study of developments over the reporting period, I certified to Congress today that Hong Kong does not continue to warrant treatment. No responsible person can assert today that Hong Kong maintains a high degree of autonomy from China. While the United States once hoped that free and prosperous Hong Kong would provide a model for authoritarian China, it is now clear that China is modeling Hong Kong after itself." And on top of all of this, the House is moving forward with its promise to sanction different Chinese officials if they move forward with this, say, ruining of Hong Kong's autonomy. So here we have CNBC saying that the House sends China's sanctions bill to Trump's desk as tensions escalate. And so what are we seeing here? We're seeing the United States upholding an agreement that it had before, notably the State Department talking about the Hong Kong Policy Act that assesses the autonomy of Hong Kong as it relates to China. We're seeing the United States making threats when it comes to different U.S. lawmakers threatening sanctions on Chinese officials if they move forward with this and following through on that. In other words, we're seeing them putting their money where their mouth is. And this isn't just Republicans, Democrats. We've seen bipartisan support for a lot of these things. Right now what we're seeing is the United States standing up once again and playing this role of world leader. We're seeing the United States again take up that mantle. And it's something that we haven't really seen in a long time, I think, which is the United States taking a very strong stance against a pretty powerful country, and one that the United States is very closely tied to economically. And as the different factors are being unwound, as the different ties to China are being undone, the United States is also not hesitating to hold the regime accountable when it abuses its own people. And we've seen as well that as the United States has done this, many other countries in the world have done the same. Australia, for example, New Zealand, for example, Canada, for example, many countries in the EU, for example, even parts of Africa are taking their stands against the Chinese Communist Party, specifically because black Africans were being discriminated against by Chinese authorities when it came to the virus, but they're standing up against them. We're seeing as the United States takes this mantle up again, as the United States puts its foot down and says, this is where the line is, you don't cross it. And when they do cross it, they move forward with their promises to take action. That as the United States does that, as it makes these statements, as it holds its ground, that other countries and other leaders are willing to do the same. And so again, this is a return, at least to my analysis, and at least to an extent, of the United States once again playing the role that the world counts on it to play, which is the role of a nation, a very powerful nation, upholding international basic rights. Now that said, folks, agree with me, disagree with me, let me know in the comments section. I do read the comments. And also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We're going to be, again, doing the show Monday through Friday, 5 days a week. And yes, I know past couple days we did not broadcast, and I apologize for that. We should have probably put something up beforehand. Again, I'm going to be back in the office starting next week, and so we're getting a few things ready for that. That said, folks, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy. We'll see you next time.